joining us today on Lattes with Leaders.
I'm Zainab.
And I'm Trisha. And we're excited for you to join us as we catch up over coffee with CEOs and executives from diverse backgrounds and industries.
We seek to discover what is unique about each leader and educate you guys on new and interesting topics. Our conversations seek to enlighten and inspire people from around the world to realize that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things.
The experiments out there in blockchain are maybe showing the business model is not viable. So, okay, let's take a few steps back and understand something like blockchain, which can be incredibly powerful, not just in financial services, but in other sectors as well. What's its value? And how does the infrastructure on blockchain enable us to solve all kinds of problems that historically weren't possible?
Amy Radin is a strategist, growth hacker, and problem solver who brings over 25 years of experience as a Fortune 100 marketing, digital, and innovation operating executive to boards and executive teams at both large enterprises and startups. She's also authored the award-winning book, The Changemaker's Playbook, How to Seek, Seed, and Scale Innovation in Any Company. We're excited to speak with her about the frameworks and strategies to innovate across industries. Thank you so much, Amy, for joining us. We're so excited to have you on the podcast today. So to start off with, Amy, we'd love to quickly go over your career to date and then dive into some of the topics that we have.
Sure. And I want to say really great to be here and be on the program. I love what you're doing. So happy to participate. And so my career basically, I'd say, has three chapters. Chapter one was after graduating from Wharton, where I got my MBA in marketing. On top of an undergraduate degree in the humanities, I joined American Express and worked for almost 15 years as a direct marketer. And really love the brand, really love financial services. It's a great sector, always something new happening. Lots of need for change and innovation. And then I was at a small retail bank where I had continued my career for a couple of years and started to see an incredible amount of activity around the internet, which back then and around 1999 was, people were scratching their heads around what is this? But there was this intense activity building in Silicon Valley. And I started getting a lot of recruiting calls to join startups as a head of marketing, and wasn't really ready to go in that direction, but started to see the connection between my background in direct marketing, which really is all about using data and technology and customer insight to create value, saw the relevance of that to what was happening in digital, and was recruited to lead the digital transformation of the U.S. credit card business for Citigroup, which at the time, back in the day, at peak, was a $5 billion P&L. So on a standalone basis, could have been a Fortune 40 company, and went there. And it was an incredible experience for about 9 years, driving the efforts and leading the development of a vision and strategy and execution to define what's the role of digital in this business, and really from almost a white piece of paper. My last role at Citi was as their first chief innovation officer, and I guess one of the first chief innovation officers in the world, helping teams around the world in different markets where Citi was doing business understand how they could bring the discipline and skills of innovation to identifying and crafting new business models to help them take advantage of what was happening with technology and changing consumer attitudes. So that was chapter two, sort of, corporate digital and innovation. That ended with the financial crisis when I left Citi. And after a few more corporate roles in innovation, in marketing, all within financial services and insurance, I left that world and started what I call Chapter 3, which is I've built a new career building on my book, The Changemaker's Playbook, How to Seek, Seed, and Scale Innovation in Any Company. Really built a new career advising executives, either at startups or large enterprises, who know that their business has to be led by a deep understanding of customers in order to thrive. And from my corporate career, I bring the marketing, digital, and innovation expertise and out-of-the-box ways of thinking so that I can help my clients see things differently, because that's often what's required to move forward in a world where the old rules rarely apply.
So, Amy, we've spoken a lot about kind of your career and how broad that career has been in terms of both bringing in new innovation, leading innovative teams. And part of that is really about influence and being able to bring in your network, being able to leverage your contact base and really leverage those relationships to be able to do what you want to do. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you've been able to develop the depth of relationships, particularly part of the reason Trish and I started this podcast actually was all to do with when you're doing an MBA, what they really push you to do is go for a lot of coffee catch-ups, build that rich network, develop those relationships. And something personally that I think I've struggled with is I have a lot of coffee catch-ups with a lot of people, but actually getting to the point where that relationship switches from having a casual catch-up about work every once a quarter or biannually to it being a relationship that has insight and value for both people.
Yeah, I think that's a great topic. And I talk a lot about my network. And the funny thing about me is my friends always tell me, God, Amy, you're such a great networker, but I am actually intensely introverted. So I don't know what went well for me, but I enjoy, I think part of it is my curiosity and desire to learn. Because of that, I'm very interested to meet new people and understand what they do. But I think the important thing about networking to make it successful is you can't think about networking as I'm going to meet people because I need something. I need a job or I need advice or I need whatever. You have to start with a mindset of, I really want to build a relationship. Here's an interesting person who I want to get to know for whatever reason. And I can be, they might want to know me too. And so approaching relationship building with real authentic interest in having a relationship, sometimes it's fine. There are people you may call and say, listen, I really want your help on this. That's fine. But then how can I help you? So how can you authentically and with a good heart make it a two-way relationship?
How do you get from, I suppose, that superficial base to networking? So say, for instance, we reach out to you, you've kindly enough come onto our podcast and given us a whole episode of content, which is great. And then say ongoing, we wanted to continue that relationship in the future to actually foster something. What would you suggest we could do next, just from a practical perspective?
Well, some of the things that I do, I'm thinking in my mind of a few people in my network who, in my own mind, I've committed to, I want to have stronger, more personal relationships with them. So there are a couple of people who I started just tagging on my LinkedIn post because I thought they would enjoy the posts. They then started commenting on my posts. And then I started commenting on their comments. And then we got to a point where we said, you know what, let's get on a Zoom call and just have a conversation. And then all of a sudden, wow, maybe there's something we could work on together. And I didn't go into that conversation saying, I want to get something from this person. I was saying, here's a person who shares some of my philosophies. And so I'm going to engage with them more on social media. And I can think of one person who that is really happening with. There is a woman who is who's been in my professional network for years, and she and some colleagues just published a book. And I said, I'd be happy to help you promote the book on social media. And yesterday I was in New York and over at her apartment and met her co-authors, and we spent 2 hours just having coffee and chatting. And so it's like, wow, these people, like I want to count them as friends. So it was, not with an agenda, but just people who seem like-minded, who seem to share my values. And then you take an action to be helpful to them. But then there are other people in my broader network who, if I come across an article or I publish something that I think they would be interested in, I'll just reach out in an email and say, hey, just publish this thought. It would be helpful to you. So I just stay in touch.
And it's interesting, Amy, because financial services itself has obviously, since the time that you started your journey compared to where it is now, has changed quite considerably, given that we had the GFC. A lot of regulation around the GFC was around how do you actually demonstrate that the product that you're trying to deliver to the customer is the right product for that customer, and the customer actually has a requirement or a need for that product. What's your view on how that's changed over the period of time that you've been working in the industry, and what's that meant for innovation within financial services organizations as well?
Well, I think that technology, the changes in technology and the volume and availability of data have introduced a whole new level of possibility, but also complexity that are making new products and services possible. But as has always been the case throughout history, what technology can do tends to outpace our ability as humans to grasp it and figure out what to do with it. So you could see, for example, the whole world of blockchain, right? And, this year, some well-publicized, blow-ups around crypto companies that a lot of people thought crypto was the core application for blockchain. I think there are clearly, based on what's happened so far, we're seeing the experiments out there in blockchain are maybe showing the business model is not viable. So, okay, let's take a few steps back and understand something like blockchain, which can be incredibly powerful, not just in financial services, but in other sectors as well. What's its value? And how does the infrastructure on blockchain enable us to solve all kinds of problems that historically weren't possible? Artificial intelligence. I was at an executive roundtable yesterday with there were leaders from 20 countries, virtual, obviously, talking about artificial intelligence and just its potential for customer engagement. And it really does kind of blow you away when you think about what is becoming possible and the implications for that. I think, though, there's also the opportunity for, accelerating a world of haves and have-nots, further polarization. So I think there's a positive side, and there are implications and consequences to some of the innovations that are emerging that are going to have ethical considerations also. So I think those are going to get deeper, and we're going to have to watch out for them, not just in financial services, but in other sectors as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in financial services, I think the slant on that is definitely because of it being so heavily regulated. I mean, I'm originally from the UK, and there's heavy regulation in the UK, I think even more so than the US. I always found when we were doing innovation projects and trying to do something quite extreme, that became a little bit more challenging, where you have technology that, as you said, rightly so, there is incredible potential, but you don't necessarily have the level of control with something like AI, or even the understanding necessarily of the capability of that technology to be able to then go back to regulators and prove and provide evidence that you're doing the right thing by the customer at every point in their journey.
It gets very complicated. And there are a lot of examples like that happening around financial services and insurance, where because of the processing power of technology and the availability of data, decision-making can be taken to a level that we never imagined.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, was it AXA that decided to use, they found a link between social media profiles and likelihood to get into an accident. And I remember as that started to get publicized, they basically had to pull that data from their evaluation because there was such uproar about using people's personal data. But the reality of the world in which we're driving towards is actually financial services organizations have so much data on individuals, and how you use that to personalize the experience for customers in a way that is ethical is becoming more and more of a modern challenge, I think, for a lot of these organizations.
And I think what all of these industries, I think the winners for the long term, in terms of the brands that really win customer loyalty, that employees want to work for, that the regulators value, are going to be the ones who look for the win-win with the customer. So too often in financial services, customers feel, and I've been in enough focus groups to hear this, when the bank wins, I lose, right? And so I think part of the value system and the ethical core and the culture of these institutions, the more the people in these organizations look for the win-wins. How do I leverage data and technology so that the corporation benefits and all of our stakeholders benefit, not just shareholders? And the whole emphasis on ESG, which of course is, way further ahead in Europe than I think it's much more on the horizon in the United States, is going to push companies to look harder and think and act more seriously against, their sustainability goals and its sustainability of society. How do we contribute to vibrant communities? And it's not just by making donations, right? It's by how you serve your customers.
It takes a great deal of convincing and a great deal of influence to be able to get people to believe in your vision. As someone who has been in that position, right, as an innovation leader, how do you think about what is your approach to getting people behind a vision and really getting people to believe that this is the path forward and this is how you can create value both for customers as well as for the business?
First of all, as an innovator, there are always going to be many people around you who are telling you it's variations on the theme of it's never going to work, right? And so one thing I used to tell my teams who were working on different projects, and they would go out around the organization and encounter this kind of resistance. I'd say, look, you're sort of on a tightrope, because on the one hand, you have to be stubborn and have the courage of your convictions and not get worn down. On the other hand, you really have to listen to what people are telling you and be open to the possibility that there could be some really good input there. So you're walking always a very fine line. If you're not sufficiently stubborn, you'll give up. But if you don't listen, you will miss nuggets that are very important. And also, you won't build support within the organization, which if you're in an enterprise, ultimately, you will not be able to scale a big, bold, new concept without broader organization support beyond your team. So that's part one answer to that question. Part two is, my team took a page from all of my experience as a direct marketer, which is you have to test and learn. And this is what I still now that I have clients, very committed to this model of you can't go out, or it's very hard to go out with the big, bold vision and say, well, the sky is going to fall, the world is going to end, the companies go out of business if we don't do this, we have to do this. Like, that is just not going to work, especially if you're in a company that's doing well. People are just not going to believe you. Better to start to construct and execute small-scale tests that allow you to go to market and start to prove and validate and learn from, is this concept going to work or not? Is part of it right, but part of it's wrong? What will it really take to execute? And by getting in the game and testing and experimenting and constantly building upon each experiment to get to the next one, pulling in people around the organization to understand what you're doing, you will build interest. And then as your experiments bear fruit and are successful, at least some of the time, people start to believe. So people need, if you're doing something, if you're working on something that has never been done before, it's very hard for people to believe. But if you show them with a test result, it's like, oh, wow, can I be part of it? And so that concept of test and learn is really important. And it's what startups do. Founders start prototyping and they go to market with small scale alphas and then beta tests and see what works and what doesn't work. And they build support. And then for those that work, they're able to go to investors and they're telling them their story and they're able to raise money when they've done a good job in their experiments and prototypes. It's no different inside an enterprise. It's just your audiences are a little different, right? Your investors may be the broader employee base at large or the CFO. But you need to do that.
Yeah. And it almost sounds like a risk mitigation strategy as well, right? Like if you go all in on something that you just don't know is going to work, well, what if it doesn't work, right?
Absolutely. I'd rather have a tiny budget and be really scrappy and try a few things below the radar. And in fact, the way we used to look at our innovation projects back at Citi was we said, we're going to build a portfolio of bets. Some things that are higher risk, but higher potential to pay off, lower risk, but maybe incrementally just cost saving, innovations driving cost savings. And so we had kind of our 4-box with our portfolio laid out. And the way my CEO would look at it would be, even if everything failed, which that did not happen. We had many successes. We could take our whole investment and cover it in our bigger budget. So we invested very tiny, we would just very scrappily get small scale pilots moving, and some would be discarded, some would be pursued. But when you do it like that, it's much easier. And frankly, it wears down the resistance internally because people cannot complain when you're working with a small budget.
You've mentioned that you've had a few successes and a few failures. I want to first talk about the successes. So what happens when something is successful? What's that next step look like in terms of actually scaling innovation across a big corporate?
Right. Well, I think at that point, and I think it's really no different than in a startup. If you get to that moment in proving your concept, when you have the organization support to scale, right? The money's, you're getting the funding from CFO, the CEO, and the business unit heads are behind it. You've got to, at that point, rethink your processes. You might need more people. You have to really tighten up the ship. So you may have been, I think about one example. It took us a couple of years, and at this point, this was a while ago, so it might sound almost quaint. We had to prove the case and show the organization that we could innovate how to acquire new card members, moving from a direct mail model to a digitally oriented model, right? Now, that may not sound very innovative, but at the time, that was radical. So after, say, a year and a half or so of testing and learning, we proved the viability that we could acquire customers that had the credit profile that we desired online at a cost per account that was very attractive, and we knew how to execute. But we had been doing that, with a couple of people, a lot of manual workarounds, manual reporting, not an automated dashboard. So all of a sudden, if you want to scale something, which in the credit card industry, acquisition has traditionally been a core engine of growth. This is something that's strategically very important. You have to automate. You've got to make sure that you have robust, well-documented processes. There's a lot of regulatory requirements. So you've got to go back and look at, well, how am I executing in test or low volume mode, and what needs to change so that my infrastructure, my foundation is robust enough to carry the scale that I'm trying to achieve. So it's a lot more than just having the dollars. It's really, you've got to go back and relook at all that and make it like, now you got to be ready for prime time. And I think that's something a lot of startups struggle with. The people who got you to that point may not be the people who are going to take you forward. So there may be a lot of talent implications that you've got to think about. People who like being at the beginning of the funnel, sort of figuring out the concepts and mucking around the prototypes, may not be the people who are going to generate volume at scale and with attractive financials.
You've talked a little bit about the successes, but of course there would be failures on the flip side. How do you, what is your response to failures? How do you learn from failures? Because of course, in the startup world, failures are not necessarily a bad thing. It's about figuring out what you can do with those failures.
We have to kind of recondition ourselves because, to me, it's not failure if you've learned from it. And on the point about startups, and I'm a limited partner in an angel investor fund, and the managing director for the fund, he says this all the time. He really likes investing in founders who have failures in their past because they have learned from them. And they will do better, if they come back into the ring. They have the potential, if they demonstrate, a willingness to learn, they will be better the next time. So I think innovators in the enterprise world need help from their sponsors, from their management, to really treat the things that don't go well as learning. I think also in the innovation process, if you are always systematically taking learnings from the last project forward to what are we going to do next, the organization can start to see, we tried something and it didn't work. What did we learn? How can we be better next time? So you can influence creating that sort of vibe in your language and how you manage it. So then it's your job as the leader to at least, you can't control the entire enterprise if you're in a big company, but at least within your team, what are you doing to create a culture where people are comfortable sharing lessons learned, including the lessons about, we shouldn't have done it that way. This is what we learned. What would I do next time? It's your responsibility to create that environment.
Yeah, and I think implementing those lessons learned as well. We do retrospectives very often, and it's almost just a ceremony. It's part of your agile processes sometimes, rather than you actually take a lot of those lessons learned, implement them, engage with them, and continue to learn from them as an ongoing practice. And I think that latter part requires such a change in culture that sometimes it can be a little bit more challenging to actually do than just holding a retrospective, for instance.
Yeah, no, I agree. But however, each organization is going to have its own way of doing it. But the important thing is to reflect upon and codify what you've learned from each experiment and
Mm,
make sure that that knowledge is applied going forward. That's how you get better, and those learnings fuel future successes.
yeah. Um, And Amy, I think I just want to reflect on our conversation today. I think it's been so interesting to hear from your perspective, having had such a long career in financial services and in the innovation space, to actually see how that's grown over time and what you've learned from that journey. So thank you very much for sharing with us today. Really appreciate it.
Don't forget to check out our more recent episodes where we connect with global female CEOs to explore how to make it to the top. Whether your ambition is to be an executive at a corporate, build a franchise, or pivot your traditional career, check us out. Be sure to give us a like or follow on LinkedIn, TikTok, or Instagram at Lattes With Leaders. Our mission is to hear the voices of women from around the world. So if you're an avid listener and want your voice heard through our platform, please reach out.